Brian says we're taking over this place, Mom. You'll be out in 60 days. Her voice was flat, almost bored, like she was telling me the mail had arrived. But it was my daughter standing in my kitchen announcing the end of my home. I gripped the counter so hard my fingers ached. Taking over? This house is mine? She tilted her head, not for long. With the inheritance, we can finally make real changes. This little bungalow. Perfect for our expansion. My jaw tightened. And where exactly am I supposed to go? You'll figure it out? You're resourceful, she said, like I was an unwanted tenant. Brian says you'll thank us once you're settled. I could feel the heat rising in my face. After 3 years of me covering your rent shortfall, fixing your plumbing, paying Ethan's school fees, this is your thank you. Her mouth curled into a smirk. We didn't ask you to pay our bills. You chose to? The air in my chest turned sharp. I helped because you needed it. Shh, and now we don't, she said, glancing toward the porch where Brian's voice rang out. We'll knock out the wall, add a second story. She's fine with it. She's fine with it. The words cut deeper than the wind blasting through the open door. I stepped closer, voice low. You're throwing your mother out of her own home? Her eyes didn't waver. Ethan's growing up. He doesn't need you hanging around all the time. That one landed where she meant it to. Straight into the softest part of me. My hands trembled against the counter. I curled them into fists until the shaking eased, my nails biting into my palms. This is my home. I said every syllable steady, but I'm not leaving. Her gaze hardened. We can make this ugly if you want. She turned and walked out, gravel crunching under her shoes. Brian looked up, grinned, and threw an arm around her shoulders. They stood there like they'd already won. I closed the door slowly, the latch clicking like a lock on my chest. The Pacific roared in the distance, relentless and cold. I went to my desk, opened the top drawer, and rested my hand on the folder with the deed. My name alone. They thought I'd pack quietly. They thought wrong. Before this was over, Brian would learn that the only thing more dangerous than taking what isn't yours is underestimating the woman who owns it. If your own child told you to leave your home so they could take it, would you fight to stay or walk away? The door had barely latched before the memories started pressing in, uninvited. 3 years earlier, I'd stood in almost the same spot, only then the air smelled of fresh paint and hope. Lydia had hugged me hard that day, laughing as Ethan darted past us into the kitchen, already claiming a chair for Grandma's pancakes. I'd sold the house in Salem in a rush of practicality and sentiment. Too big for me alone after Robert died, too far from the coast I'd always loved. The bungalow in Bandon felt like a fresh chapter. Close enough to help them, close enough to watch Ethan grow. Back then, Brian had been between jobs. Again. His side projects never lasted, but he thanked me with a sheepish grin when I covered their rent shortfall. Lydia worked long shifts at the spa, so I picked Ethan up from school, fed him dinner, and stayed until she got home. The first winter, their furnace gave out during a cold snap. I wrote the check without thinking. Lydia had said, "We'll pay you back, Mom," but the subject never came up again. I didn't mind. Or at least, I told myself I didn't. Helping them was how I stayed needed. I remembered the nights Ethan would fall asleep against my shoulder while we read by the fire. His small hand would curl around my arm, warm and trusting. Those moments felt like proof that my choice to be here mattered. But there were cracks even then. Brian's complaints about how small the place feels started before the paint had dried on their rental. Lydia's texts for "just a little help until Friday" came more often. Once, after I covered their overdue utility bill, I overheard Brian telling a friend, "She's basically our safety net. Saves us from thinking too hard about money." It stung, but I pushed it aside. The summer after that, Ethan broke his arm. I stayed at the hospital with him while Lydia handled paperwork. Brian showed up hours later, smelling of beer, making jokes about how, "Least the kid will have a story." I swallowed my frustration. Looking back now, I could see it, how every favor became expected, how every act of love was quietly folded into their sense of entitlement. The tide outside crashed against the rocks, pulling me back to the present. My hands rested on the counter, the same counter where Ethan once sprinkled too many chocolate chips into pancake batter. I used to believe proximity meant connection. But now, standing alone in this kitchen, I understood that sometimes it just makes it easier for people to take from you without ever noticing what they've taken. The shift was gradual, like a slow tide eroding the shore. One moment I was a welcome part of their daily life. The next I was a fixture they barely acknowledged. Except when they needed something. It was small at first. Brian leaving receipts for repairs on my counter, as if I'd just pay them without question. Lydia calling to say she was too busy to pick up Ethan, so could I take him to the dentist? Of course I could. I always could. Then there was the birthday barbecue 2 summers ago. I'd bought all the food, marinated the meat, baked the cake. As guests arrived, Brian took the credit, smiling as he said, "We went all out this year." Not a word about me. Not even to Ethan, who was proudly wearing the little paper crown I'd made. That night, I stood at the sink washing dishes while laughter floated in from the porch. My hands were in hot, soapy water, but I felt cold all over. It wasn't the work, it was the invisibility. The fall after that, Lydia asked if I could cover Ethan's school trip. "It's just until Brian's commission comes through," she'd said. Weeks later, when I asked about it, she waved me off. "Oh, that deal fell apart. But thanks for helping." Somewhere in those months, my help stopped being help. It became assumed. Expected. The memory that stung most came last Christmas. I'd saved up to buy Ethan a new bike, bright red, with a bell that chimed like joy. On Christmas morning, Brian wheeled it out, grinning. "Look what Dad got you." Ethan's eyes lit up. He hugged Brian. And I just stood there, smiling like I hadn't been the one who scraped together the money. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as Ethan was happy. But deep down, it did matter. It mattered every time they took without asking, every time they rewrote the story to erase me. The present slammed back into focus, the words Lydia had spoken today still echoing. "You'll be out in 60 days. Now I could see how we got here?" The small slights had been stepping stones leading to that one brutal sentence. Outside, the sky was turning the color of wet slate, the wind smelling of rain. I ran my hand along the counter, the same counter where so much of our family life had unfolded. I thought I'd built something lasting by being near them. But maybe I'd only taught them how easy it was to take me for granted. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in front of half the town. I'd stopped by the dockside cafe to pick up Ethan after school. He liked to sit with a cocoa while I waited for Lydia to finish her shift. The place smelled of salt and frying fish, voices humming over the clink of cups. Brian was there, leaning at the counter with 2 of his friends. I nodded, ready to pass without a word, but he caught my arm. "Hey," he said loudly, "make sure you wipe your feet before you walk into our place." I froze. "Your place?" His grin widened. "Yeah. The one you're keeping warm for us until the renovations start." The men beside him laughed. The sound was sharp, deliberate. "Brian," I said evenly, "this is my home." He sipped his beer, eyes glittering. "For now. But let's be honest, you're just temporary." Something in my chest pulled tight. Around us, a couple at the corner table glanced up, then away. "You don't need to talk to me like that," I said. He shrugged, turning back to his friends. "I'm just saying what everyone knows. She's been hanging on here because she's got nowhere else to go. We're giving her plenty of notice." The casual cruelty in his tone hit harder than the words themselves. I felt Ethan's small hand slip into mine. He'd heard it. I wanted to pull him away, but Brian wasn't finished. "Honestly," he went on, "this setup's been good for you. You get to play grandma without paying for a roof. We handle the real bills." Heat surged into my face. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back. I tightened my grip on Ethan's hand until I could feel his pulse. "You know that's not true," I said quietly. Brian laughed, low and dismissive. "We didn't ask you to pay our bills, remember?" "You chose to." Ethan's fingers squeezed mine. I looked down at him, his eyes wide, cheeks flushed. That was enough. I turned without another word, guiding him toward the door. The cool sea air hit us as we stepped outside, carrying the scent of kelp and rain. On the walk home, Ethan didn't speak, neither did I. My mind replayed each word, each smirk, until they blurred into a steady throb behind my temples. By the time we reached my porch, the trembling in my hands had stopped. The anger had settled into something heavier, denser. They weren't just planning to take my home. They wanted to strip away my dignity before they did it. That night, the rain came hard, drumming against the roof. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, the steam curling into the dim light. The phone rang. Lydia's number. "Mum," she said. Voice tight. "Brian's upset you embarrassed him at the cafe?" My jaw tightened. "I didn't embarrass him. He did that himself." She sighed like I was a stubborn child. Look, maybe you should apologize. It'll smooth things over. Apologize? For what? For making him feel small in public, she said. You know how he gets. I stared at the rain sliding down the window. He called me temporary Lydia. In front of Ethan. There was a pause, then her tone sharpened. Well, maybe he's right. Maybe it's time you started thinking about where you'll go. We've been patient, but this is my house. I cut in. Her voice dropped to a cool edge. Not forever. And the sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be. The line went dead before I could answer. I set the phone down. The click of it against the table louder than it should have been. My chest felt tight, but my hand stayed steady this time. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. Not polite. 3 sharp raps. I opened it to find Brian, rain dripping from his jacket, a grin plastered on his face. Forgot to tell you, he said, stepping inside without waiting. We've scheduled the inspection for next month. You might want to start boxing up your stuff. I held my ground. You're not moving anything out of here. He looked me up and down, the grin widening. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You could have left with some grace. Now, well, let's just say the story going around town won't be pretty. The threat slid between us like a cold blade. Get out of my house, I said. He chuckled, brushing past me toward the door. 60 days, Helen. Tick-tock. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the quiet, the rain muffling the edges of the world. The anger from the cafe hadn't faded. It had settled deeper, anchoring itself in the space between my ribs. They wanted me to feel powerless. They wanted me to believe their timeline was the only one that mattered. But as I moved to the desk and laid my hand on the folder with the deed, I realized something. Their arrogance was a weakness. And I was going to use it. It was late Thursday morning when Lydia showed up unannounced, a manila folder clutched under her arm. Mom, can we sit for a minute? She asked, but didn't wait before dropping into a chair. I stayed standing. What is it? She slid the folder across the table. Just some paperwork Brian needs for the inspection. Sign where I've marked, and it'll make everything smoother. I didn't touch it. Inspection for what? Her eyes flicked away. You know, for the renovations. It's just a formality. Won't change anything for you? The rain tapped the windows. I opened the folder. Inside sat a dense legal document. Halfway down the first page, my name appeared, followed by language I hated. Transfer of interest? Property consolidation. This isn't an inspection form, I said. She shifted in her chair. It's just legal language. The lawyer said it's standard. I looked up. Standard for giving my house away? Her cheeks flushed. Don't be dramatic. Combining properties makes things simpler for everyone. For everyone, I said. Except me. Her voice sharpened. Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Brian's been patient. He's trying to include you in the process, including me by tricking me into signing over my home. She rolled her eyes. You always assume the worst. If you sign now, we can make sure you're comfortable when you move. You'll have a say in where you go, when, not if. The word lodged like a stone. I closed the folder. The paper rasped under my fingertips. New. Her lips pressed thin. If you don't sign, it's going to get messy. And you might not like how it ends. The chill in her tone cut deeper than the damp air. Heat climbed my neck, a slow burn meeting the draft along the floor. I kept my hands flat, steady. Tell Brian I'm not signing anything without my lawyer, I said. She stood, chair scraping hard. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. She took a step, then paused. Honestly, Mom, you make everything difficult. You picked this place without thinking. You created the problem. I let the words pass over me like cold rain. The problem, I said softly, is that you think my life is yours to rearrange. Her mouth twitched, then hardened. She left without another word. When the door shut, the house breathed. I stayed at the table, listening to the rain's thin hiss on the roof, the hum of the refrigerator, the clock's dry tick. I set my palm on the folder. I thought about the first check I wrote for them. The way Lydia's hands trembled with relief. The gratitude that evaporated by spring. I remembered Ethan's small laugh over pancakes, how he would steal the first bite, sugar dusting his lip. The memory steadied me. It reminded me why I could not fold. I'd managed budgets, contracts, and grants when I ran the library. I know the weight of signatures. I slid the folder into my desk drawer and turned the key. The click sounded. Across the room, the kettle began to murmur. I poured hot water over a tea bag, watched the swirl bloom from pale to amber. The mint rose bright. I breathed it in until the burn cooled. They wanted this quick, quiet, They counted on my age, my habit of saying yes, my love for peace. I set the cup down and straightened my shoulders. Peace can wait right now. Dignity cannot. Let them bring more papers. Let them practice their lines. I will read every word. I will not sign away my home. Brian's laugh was still echoing in my ears when I closed the drawer. The forged signature on that paper, it wasn't just ink. It was a theft of every hour I'd worked, every night I'd stayed up worrying about their bills. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought secondhand, and refinished myself, and stared at my trembling hands. Years of paying rent for them, fixing leaks, replacing appliances, now reduced to a lie that said I wanted to hand it all over. I could almost hear Brian's voice again from that morning. "We didn't ask you to pay our bills, Helen. You chose to?" That the words sliced deeper than the paper cut on my thumb from opening their drawer. I'd told myself, over and over, that family helps family. But this was family helping themselves to what was mine. The kettle clicked off, steam curling up like a ghost I couldn't quite catch. I didn't even remember turning it on. I poured water into my mug, but my hands shook so much it sloshed over the rim. That's when Lydia's voice joined his in my head. Soft, almost sweet, but sharpened at the edges. "Ethan's growing up. He doesn't need you hanging around all the time." As if my love for my grandson was an inconvenience. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about erasing me, my role, my worth, my place in this family. They wanted the house and they wanted me gone in every sense. I picked up the forged deed again, holding it to the light. The notary stamp was smudged, wrong font, wrong date. Brian was careless, too sure I'd never look. But I'd been around long enough to know that carelessness is the first crack in a scheme. I slid the papers into a manila envelope, tucking it deep into my coat pocket. Every step from now on had to be quiet, precise. One wrong move, and they'd change the locks before I could act. I went to the small desk in my bedroom, pulling open the bottom drawer. Receipts, bank statements, letters from the property tax office. Everything neatly clipped, dated, in order. I ran my fingers over the folder tabs, each one a reminder that I'd always kept my affairs straight, even when theirs were chaos. Somewhere between the second and third folder, a memory caught me, standing in the rain outside Lydia's apartment years ago, holding a check to cover their overdue rent. Brian had thanked me, briefly before adding, "We'll pay you back when we can." They never did. Now, they weren't just avoiding repayment. They were trying to take the source of it all. I shut the drawer slowly, as if sealing a vow. No shouting, no warning. They would find out in a lawyer's office, with witnesses, and the truth laid out in black and white. The wind rattled the bungalow's windows, carrying the smell of salt and damp wood. This was my home, bought with my own money, my own choices, my own sacrifices. If they thought a couple of forged pages could take that from me, they hadn't learned who they were dealing with. I wrapped the envelope tighter in my coat and sat back down at the table. The tea had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. Bitterness, I was learning, could be an acquired taste, and I intended to serve it quietly when the time was right. The silence started small. No more casual knocks on my back door, no invitations to join them for coffee or to watch Ethan's soccer practice. At first, I told myself they were just busy. But then the pattern sharpened. Brian parking on the far side of their driveway so he wouldn't pass my window, Lydia keeping her phone calls short and her eyes fixed on the ground when she walked to the mailbox. The house felt colder even with the heat on. Meals tasted flat. I caught myself listening for footsteps in the hall, knowing none would come. On Tuesday morning, I saw them loading their car. Ethan's small suitcase was strapped to the roof rack. Lydia noticed me at the window but didn't wave. They drove off without a word. By afternoon, I found out from a neighbor they'd gone to Portland for the weekend. Something about getting away to enjoy the new chapter. I wasn't part of that chapter. I was a footnote they were trying to erase. That evening, I took my tea to the porch. The ocean was restless, rolling against the shore in uneven breaths. I wrapped my cardigan tighter, the wind pricking at my skin. Across the yard, their windows were dark. No one to watch TV with, no ladder spilling across the grass. I thought about all the times I'd stepped in without being asked. Paying Ethan's preschool tuition, covering Brian's emergency dental bill, buying Lydia the winter coat she said she couldn't afford. They'd taken it all, and now they were taking the air from my lungs, one day at a time. The only break in the frost came from Ethan. When they were home, he'd sneak over in the afternoons, pretending to borrow sugar or a pencil for homework. He'd sit at my kitchen table, chattering about school and friends, feet swinging above the floor. One day as he reached for a cookie, he whispered, "Mom says not to bother you." "But I wanted to see you." The words caught in my throat. I managed a smile, sliding the plate toward him. "You can bother me anytime," I said. When he left, I watched him run across the yard, glancing back once to wave. It was the kind of small, defiant kindness that made the rest of the week bearable. But the isolation worked its way deeper. Phone calls from old friends went unanswered because I couldn't find the voice to explain what was happening. The TV stayed off most nights. I couldn't stand the fake cheer of sitcoms. Even the ocean's rhythm, once a comfort, began to feel like a countdown. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to leave without a fight, to believe I was alone enough to make it easier for them. I closed the curtains that night and sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. My fingers found the edge of the manila envelope in my desk drawer. They thought they were cutting me off, but all they were doing was sharpening my focus. They could keep their distance. I could play that game too. And when the time came, they'd see just how much I'd been paying attention. By the following week, the air between our two houses had grown thicker. Even the short waves from Lydia stopped. When I crossed the yard to check my mailbox, she turned her back as if suddenly fascinated by her potted plants. Ethan's visits became rarer. Once, I saw him pressed to their living room window, his hand half raised, until Brian's voice called sharply from behind him. The curtain fell before I could wave back. I filled my days with small tasks, mending a loose seam on my cardigan, cleaning the pantry shelves, rearranging the spice rack. It was busy work, a way to keep from counting the hours without a knock on my door. Some afternoons, I'd walk the shoreline, letting the wind whip against my cheeks. The gulls wheeled overhead, their calls slicing the stillness. I thought about how they circled and waited before diving, patient, deliberate. I understood that now. A neighbor, Mrs. Clark, stopped me outside the post office one morning. She leaned in, voice low. "I heard you might be moving soon. Lydia said you're ready for something smaller." The words landed heavy. I smiled thinly. "I'm not going anywhere." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't press. It was one thing to be isolated in my own home. It was another to have my story rewritten for me. They wanted people to believe it was my choice, that I was eager to hand over my place by the sea. One evening, as I sat with my tea, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. A soft knock followed. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there holding a drawing. "It's us at the beach," he said, pointing to two stick figures holding kites. "I can't stay long. Mom's on the phone." I crouched to see it better, the smell of crayons and paper rising between us. "It's perfect," I told him. His eyes darted toward their porch light already flicking on. "I'll come back," he whispered before darting away. I closed the door slowly, the drawing pressed to my chest. That slip of paper felt like a lifeline. Nights were the hardest. The quiet pressed in on me, the walls seeming closer than they should be. I found myself replaying conversations from months ago. Lydia laughing at my casserole, Brian thanking me for a loan, trying to understand where the shift had begun. But the more I thought, the clearer it became they'd been planning this for a while. Each cold shoulder, each withheld invitation, was another brick in the wall they were building between us. I refused to let it stand without my say. In the desk drawer, the manila envelope waited. Inside, the forged documents, bank statements, and notes from my own careful observations. Every piece of paper told a part of the truth they wanted buried. I ran my fingers along the edge of the envelope. "Not yet, I told myself." Patience was no longer a virtue. It was my strategy. Through the window, I could see their porch light turn off. Somewhere in the dark, Ethan was sleeping. I hoped he knew, in the quiet corners of his mind, that I wasn't leaving him by choice. They thought isolation would weaken me. Instead, it was distilling me into something sharper, something they wouldn't see coming. And when the time came, the silence they'd built would be the perfect stage for my answer. The community hall smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table covered in raffle prizes, handmade quilts, jars of blackberry jam, a few gift certificates from local shops. I hadn't been out to an event in weeks, and the hum of conversation felt almost foreign. I found a seat near the back, slipping my tote under the chair. I was here for the library's fundraising auction. The place I'd worked for nearly 3 decades still felt like mine in some small way. The chatter quieted when Lydia and Brian walked in. Brian's arm draped over her shoulders, their smiles wide and practiced. I thought maybe we could get through the evening without a scene. I was wrong. They made their way down the aisle, stopping to greet people, shaking hands, leaning in close for hushed exchanges. I caught fragments. The big changes, finally expanding, making room. Each phrase twisted like a slow turn of a screw. When they reached my row, Lydia's gaze flicked to me, her smile tightening. "Mom," she said, voice carrying farther than it needed to. "We were just telling folks how you're getting ready for your next chapter. Downsizing is such a smart move at your age." Heads turned. A few polite smiles, some raised eyebrows. I kept my hands folded in my lap. "I haven't made any such plans," I said evenly. Brian chuckled. "Oh, come on. Don't be modest. You've been talking about how the bungalow's too much for you." The lie hung in the air like smoke. "Actually," I said, "I'm quite comfortable where I am." Lydia tilted her head as if humoring a child. "Well, we'll see how you feel once the renovations start next door. Could be noisy for someone who values peace and quiet." The implication was clear peace would not be an option for me much longer. I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. The woman seated beside me shifted uncomfortably, pretending to look through the auction catalog. The MC called for the first raffle, and conversation scattered into clapping and laughter. But the damage had been done. I could feel eyes on me, curiosity prying into the space where my dignity lived. During the break, I went to pour a cup of coffee. The percolator sputtered, the smell rising warm and bitter. A couple from the next street over approached. "We didn't know you were moving," the man said. I managed a thin smile. "Neither did I." Lydia's laugh rang out from across the room. She was holding court near the quilt display, Brian nodding along. From the way people leaned in, I knew she was telling my story without me. I stood there with the coffee warming my hands, letting their words roll off like cold rain. It was a skill I'd honed over the past months. But something was different now. Every remark, every glance, was feeding a fire that had been smoldering too long. When the auction ended, I slipped out before the crowd could press in with more questions. The night air was damp, the streetlights haloed in mist. I walked home with my coat pulled close, the taste of bitterness sharp on my tongue. They had chosen their stage carefully. Public enough to plant their version of the truth, safe enough to make me seem small if I defended myself. They thought humiliation would weaken me. Instead, it marked the line in the sand. Inside my bungalow, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeted me. I set the coffee cup in the sink and looked toward the desk drawer where the manila envelope waited. Not yet, I told myself again. But soon. I should have gone straight home, but I lingered outside the hall, letting the cool night air steady me. Through the open windows, laughter floated out, punctuated by the scrape of chairs and the clink of coffee cups. I could still hear Lydia's voice. Bright, confident, caring like a well-trained performer's. She was telling a story about how I used to help out when they first moved next door. "Mom's always been generous," she said. "But you know how it is. Sometimes help turns into control." A ripple of polite chuckles followed. Brian chimed in, lowering his tone just enough to make people lean closer. "We didn't ask her to pay our bills. She chose to." The words hit like a second slap, dragging my past kindness into the open and twisting it until it looked like meddling. I stayed just outside, my fingers gripping the strap of my tote. Each sentence felt like a bead added to a string, pulling tighter around my throat. They weren't just trying to embarrass me. They were painting a version of me that would make my eventual absence seem reasonable, even overdue. When the raffle ended, I slipped back inside, keeping to the edge of the crowd. The scent of cinnamon rolls and brewed coffee mingled in the warm air. I spotted Ethan near the dessert table, fidgeting with the ribbon on a basket of cookies. When he saw me, his face lit up, but Lydia's hand closed gently on his shoulder, steering him away. She didn't look at me. I made my way toward the exit, but Brian intercepted me with a too-wide grin. "Leaving already? You'll miss the announcement about the neighborhood improvement project." I knew exactly what he meant. The improvements. Next door that would conveniently make my life noisy and uncomfortable. "I think I've heard enough for tonight," I said, stepping past him. His smirk followed me to the door. Outside, the mist had thickened, softening the glow of the street lamps. I walked slowly, each step echoing the words I'd overheard. Control, chose to, downsizing. Halfway home, I realized I wasn't angry in the way they wanted me to be. Not explosive, not defensive, something colder was taking shape, settling into my bones. At my gate, I paused. From here, I could see both houses. Their porch light bright, mine dim but steady. Theirs looked loud, full of movement. Mine looked quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that could hold its ground. I stepped inside, set down my tote, and went to the desk. The manila envelope was right where I'd left it. I slid it out, resting it on the blotter, and opened the flap just enough to see the edge of the forged deed. It wasn't time to use it yet, but knowing it was there, ready, was its own kind of power. The phone rang, startling me. It was Mrs. Clark from up the street. "I don't know what's going on," she said carefully, "but I just wanted you to know. I don't believe everything I hear." For a moment, I couldn't speak. "Thank you?" I managed. After we hung up, I stood at the window. Across the yard, Lydia was laughing again, the sound drifting over like the clink of glass. Let her laugh, I thought. She didn't know that every word she'd spoken tonight had only strengthened my resolve. They'd staged their little scene, but the curtain hadn't fallen yet. I would choose the final act. And when it came, the audience they'd tried to win over would see the truth laid bare. For now, I let the night close around me. The ocean was a faint roar beyond the houses, steady and relentless. I matched my breathing to it, already thinking of my next move. The morning after the fundraiser, I woke with a heavy ache in my chest. Not the kind that comes from bad sleep, but the kind that lingers after you've been made a spectacle. I brewed my coffee, the hiss of the kettle filling the kitchen, and sat at the table staring at the manila envelope. It wasn't full enough yet. I needed more. By mid-afternoon, the fog had burned off, leaving the sky washed pale blue. I decided to walk over to return a pie plate Lydia had left on my porch weeks ago. No one answered my knock, but the front door was ajar, just enough for me to hear voices drifting from the kitchen. "Get her to sign it before the end of the month," Brian was saying. "If she stalls, we tell her the noise will make living here impossible. She'll cave." Lydia's voice followed sharper. "She won't. Not unless she thinks it's her idea, and Ethan can't know. He's too attached." I froze, my hand tightening on the pie plate. The scrape of a chair made me step back, my pulse hammering. I turned, pretending to head down the steps just as the door opened. "Oh, Mom," Lydia said, startled. I lifted the pie plate. "Thought you might want this back?" Her smile was quick but thin. "Thanks. We were just making plans." I walked away without another word, my ears ringing with the fragments I'd heard. Back home, I sat at my desk. The envelope waited. But this wasn't something I could write down. Not yet. I needed something solid, something they couldn't explain away. The next day, while they were out, I saw their side gate open. The wind was picking up, rattling the latch. I told myself I was just checking to make sure it wouldn't slam into the fence. Inside their shed, the air smelled of dust and motor oil. Stacks of boxes lined the wall, most labeled in Lydia's handwriting. One, pushed half under a workbench, caught my eye, a property legal. It was heavier than I expected. Inside, under old phone chargers and a chipped mug, was a folder stamped with the county recorder's seal. I flipped it open and felt my stomach drop. A copy of my deed, but not my deed. The signature was mine, but it wasn't mine. The date was recent. Attached was a transfer of ownership form, unsigned but ready, listing Lydia and Brian as joint owners, pending seller relocation. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The shed felt smaller, the air pressing in. This wasn't just scheming. This was theft dressed in paperwork. I slipped the folder back into the box exactly as I'd found it, my fingers careful on the edges. As I left, I checked the gate latch, making sure it clicked shut. Back inside my bungalow, I washed my hands, the smell of dust still clinging. Then I added a note to the envelope. "Forgery witnessed by me, 3:15 p.m. found in shed." I sat back, letting the weight of it settle. They thought they were clever, keeping it close but not too close. They didn't know I could be patient in ways they couldn't imagine. The ocean's low rumble reached through the open window. I closed my eyes and listened, matching its steady rhythm. Each wave was a reminder even the smallest shifts can reshape a shoreline. And now I had more than suspicion. I had proof. The next morning, the sky was the color of pewter, the kind of low cloud cover that made the ocean look heavier than it was. I moved through my kitchen with deliberate slowness, making toast I didn't really want, the clink of the butter knife against the plate keeping time with my thoughts. The image of that forged deed wouldn't leave me. The pen stroke that was almost mine, the date that wasn't. I needed someone to see it, someone who could confirm what I already knew without alerting Lydia and Brian. At 9 sharp, I called Dennis, my old neighbor and now a junior clerk at Martin Howe, the law office in town. Any chance you're around today? I asked. Always for you, he said. Bring me a cup of that cinnamon coffee you make, and I'm yours. I poured the coffee into a thermos, wrapped it in a towel, and tucked it into my tote. From my desk, I took out the small notepad where I'd sketched the layout of the shed and the position of the box. The folder had been too damning to risk taking, but my memory was clear. The law office smelled faintly of cedar and floor polish. Dennis met me in the lobby, his tie already loosened. We walked toward the file room, the hum of the old radiator filling the pauses. When I described what I'd found, his brow furrowed. Forgery's serious, Helen? You're sure? As sure as I am about the color of my own kitchen walls, I said. He left for a moment, returning with a thick binder. Within minutes, he'd pulled up the most recent filings for my property. There it was. The fraudulent transfer paperwork, stamped as pending. No signatures from me, but my name was listed as if the sale were a formality. Dennis slid a photocopy across the table. For your records, he said. I tucked it into the inside pocket of my tote, the weight of it settling like a stone. Back home, the wind had picked up, rattling the porch rail. From my kitchen window, I could see Lydia on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, pacing. Brian sat in a deck chair grinning at whatever she was saying. They looked relaxed. Too relaxed. I realized then that their confidence was a weakness. They believed I was isolated, humiliated, and pliable. They didn't know that I was building something under the surface. That evening, Ethan stopped by to return a library book I'd lent him. He lingered in the doorway, glancing toward his house. Mom says you might be moving, he said quietly. Do you believe that? I asked. He shook his head. I don't want you to. I smiled and rested a hand on his shoulder. I'm not going anywhere I don't choose, I said. It wasn't a promise I could explain, but it was the truth. After he left, I pulled the photocopy from my tote and placed it in the manila envelope. The paper felt cool against my fingers, the black ink sharp and certain. The envelope was getting heavier, not just with documents, but with intent. The night deepened, the ocean's roar muted by the steady hiss of wind. I sat by the window, watching the lights in Lydia's house flick on and off. Somewhere in that easy glow, they believed the story they'd crafted was airtight. I let the thought settle in. They wouldn't see it coming. Not the moment, not the method. And when the time came, the ground under them would shift as suddenly as the tide. For now, I closed the curtain, letting the darkness have the last word. The clock's red digits glowed 2:13 a.m., sharp against the dark. I lay on my back, eyes open, watching the faint sway of the curtain in the draft from the window. Sleep had been an unreliable companion lately, but tonight it refused to come at all. The ocean's low roar was steady, like breath from something enormous. Every so often, a gust of wind rattled the gutter outside, a hollow metal clang that made me flinch. I shifted the sheets cool against my skin and let my mind wander where it seemed to want to go. It walked me through the last few months. Lydia's tightened smile, Brian's casual dismissals, the way Ethan's visits had been quietly managed. Each memory was like a bead on a string, easy to hold, impossible to ignore. I thought about the forged deed, sitting in the manila envelope in my desk. The photocopy Dennis had given me was tucked there too, its edges crisp and cold. It wasn't just proof, it was a key. Don't mistake patience for weakness. Martin used to say when we argued over the best way to fix something. Plumbing, a business deal, a family quarrel. He'd died with calloused hands and a calm heart, and I'd tried to keep both in my own way. But patience had taken on a different shape now. It wasn't waiting for things to get better. It was waiting for the right moment to act. A floorboard creaked, the sound carrying strangely in the stillness. I pictured the layout of their shed again, the placement of the box, the weight of the folder in my hands. The memory wasn't just sharp, it was steadying. Proof is heavy for a reason, I thought. The house seemed to breathe with me, the faint scent of last night's tea still lingering in the kitchen. I imagined standing in the doorway of Lydia's kitchen, watching her realize the game was over. Not in anger. Anger would be too small for what I wanted. In certainty, in the simple, unshakable fact that she'd lost. I got up and padded barefoot into the living room. The moonlight spilled across the rug, turning it silver. I opened the desk drawer, took out the envelope, and set it on the table. Just looking at it, I felt the knot in my chest loosen a little. The air was cool, carrying the faint brine of the sea. I made a list in my head, documents to copy, people to speak to quietly, timing to consider. This wasn't about revenge in the way they'd expect. It was about securing what was mine, what Martin and I had built, and making sure Ethan had a future untouched by their greed. By the time the clock read 40:07 a.m., my eyes felt gritty, but my pulse was steady. The plan wasn't complete, but the spine of it was there. I slid the envelope back into the drawer, closed it gently, and returned to bed. The wind had softened. The ocean's rhythm was still there, patient and unhurried. I matched my breathing to it, not to sleep, but to something stronger. Resolve. By morning, the heaviness in my limbs felt like armor, not fatigue. I dressed without rushing, choosing the navy sweater Martin always said made my eyes sharper. The mirror caught my reflection, lined, yes, but steady. When I stepped onto the porch, the air was bright with salt and early sunlight. Lydia was in her yard, phone to her ear, her voice lilting with that public sweetness she used for anyone who wasn't me. Brian carried a stack of lumber toward the side gate, grunting as if the effort made him noble. I waved casual as a passing breeze. Brian gave a curt nod. Lydia looked through me like glass. That was fine. Let them believe they'd frozen me out completely. Inside, I cleared the kitchen table and spread out what I had. Photocopies, my original deed, tax statements, the note from Dennis. I handled each page like porcelain, aligning the edges, checking for anything I'd missed. When I was done, I slid them into 2 separate envelopes. One to keep at home, one to place somewhere safe. By mid-morning, I was walking down Main Street, tote on my shoulder. The bakery's warm air drifted out as I passed, mingling with the sharper scent of the hardware store next door. I turned into the side entrance of the library, nodding to Claire, the librarian who'd known me since Ethan was born. Got a little project, I told her quietly. She raised an eyebrow. You always do. In the back office, she let me place one envelope in the locked filing cabinet she kept for patrons who volunteered. It wasn't much, but it meant one copy was out of my house beyond reach. From there, I stopped by the post office. I filled out a change of address form, not to forward my mail yet, but to keep it ready. A contingency? I tucked it deep into my tote, the paper warm from my hands. Back home, the afternoon light slanted low, painting the bungalow in soft gold. I made tea and sat by the window, watching Lydia and Brian in their yard. They were laughing. At me, at the future they thought they owned, at some private joke they didn't know was about to sour. I thought about Martin again, how he'd fix things with method instead of noise. You don't win by shouting over the storm, he once told me. You win by building higher ground before it comes. The words settled over me like a quilt. As dusk fell, I went through the motions, washing dishes, folding laundry, checking the locks, each small act grounding me in my own space. In the shed behind my house, I found the metal toolbox Martin had kept. Inside was the old lockbox we'd used for passports and insurance papers. I tested the key, it still worked. I placed my home envelope inside, closed the lid, and slid the box back under a shelf, covering it with a coil of rope. Not hidden enough to be suspicious, but safe enough for now. When night came, I sat in the darkened living room, the only light the glow from the clock. The ocean was restless again, waves breaking just beyond sight. I imagined the moment. Calm, precise, when the ground would shift under Lydia and Brian's feet. The first moves were small, almost invisible. But they were mine, and in the quiet, I could already feel the tide turning. It started with the smallest shifts, so small no one watching would notice. That was the point. On Monday, I called the insurance company. The woman on the line had a bright voice and a slow way of speaking, as if she knew every word mattered. I told her I wanted to update my policy to list me as the sole contact and remove any secondary beneficiaries, unless I signed for them in person. She confirmed the changes, her keyboard clicking like tiny locks turning into place. By noon, I was at the bank. I smiled at the teller, a young man with a name tag that read, Corey. I'd like to review my accounts, I said, sliding my ID across the counter. In the privacy of a small office, I added withdrawal alerts to my savings account, locked it so that only I could make changes, and requested paper statements sent to my P.O. box instead of the house. Walking out into the chilly air, I felt a strange warmth in my chest. They thought I was a piece on their board. They didn't see I'd picked up my own set of pieces. Back at the bungalow, I found Lydia standing on her porch, arms crossed. Ethan's got a school fundraiser, she said, not bothering with hello. We'll need you to cover the buy-in like last year. Her tone made it sound less like a request and more like a tradition carved in stone. I can't this time, I said, keeping my voice even. Things are tight right now. Her eyebrows shot up. Tight? You own your place outright. I still have expenses. I replied, letting the pause hang just long enough to feel final. She shrugged, but her eyes narrowed. Brian stepped out behind her, a mug in his hand. "We didn't ask you to pay for things before." "You just did," he said. It was meant to be dismissive, but it landed like a confession. "That was then," I said, and turned away before they could see the satisfaction in my face. In the quiet of my kitchen, I wrote a short list on a sticky note: utilities, switch to auto-pay from my account only. Garden service, cancel for their side of the yard. Spare keys, collect from trusted hands. The last one took some creativity. I invited my neighbor, Mrs. Franks, over for coffee. In the middle of conversation, I asked for the key I'd once given her, just to check on the place while I was away. She fetched it without question, dropping it into my palm with a smile. The air outside was brisk, the kind that smelled faintly of seaweed. I walked to the hardware store, bought a new lock for the back door, and changed it before dinner. No announcement, no fuss. Just a click of the bolt and a key they didn't have anymore. That night, I sat by the window, the street lamp casting a pale circle over the empty driveway. I thought about how quiet power worked. It wasn't a storm, it was a tide, slow, steady, and impossible to push back. Across the yard, Lydia and Brian's kitchen light glowed. I imagined them there, unaware that the ground under them had shifted a fraction. Small moves, invisible for now, but already taking shape into something they couldn't undo. The kind of plan you could only make in silence. By Thursday, the steps had become a rhythm. I didn't rush them, each one needed to feel like part of an ordinary week. That morning, I took the bus into town instead of driving. No car meant no questions about where I'd been if anyone saw it missing from the driveway. At the corner of Main and Alder, I walked into Dennis Crane's office. He'd been Martin's friend before he was our lawyer, and he greeted me with the same steady handshake he always had. "Updating my will," I said, settling into the leather chair. His pen paused over the pad. "Any changes to the main asset? Yes. The bungalow stays in trust for Ethan effective when he turns 21. No early transfers, no co-ownership clauses." We went through each page slowly, the scratch of his pen and the hum of the ceiling fan the only sounds. When he was done, he slid the papers toward me. I signed in 3 places, my name neat and deliberate. Dennis stamped them, the sound like a gavel in miniature. Before leaving, I handed him the second envelope of documents. "Keep these on file, and if anyone asks, you've had them for weeks." You didn't ask why? Dennis never did. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain. I stopped by the grocery store, picking up just enough to look like I'd come for errands alone. In my cart, I tucked a prepaid phone card and a small ledger. The card would be for calls I didn't want on my home bill. The ledger was for tracking everything: moves, dates, amounts. Back home, I found a message on my answering machine. Lydia's voice, sweetened just enough to be suspicious. "Mom, can you watch Ethan on Saturday? Brian and I have a meeting about the house upgrades." I pressed the delete button without calling back. The click was sharp, final. Instead, I called Ethan directly at school, catching him before his last class. "Busy Saturday?" I asked. "Not really," he said. "Why? How about we go for ice cream and a walk by the pier?" Oh, his laugh was quick. Warm. "Yes, please." It wasn't just about the time with him. It was about reminding myself and him that our bond didn't need their permission. That night, I went through the spare bedroom, pulling out the things I'd let Lydia store there years ago. Boxes of Christmas lights, old blankets, a set of chip dishes. I stacked them neatly by the back door. Tomorrow, I'd tell her they needed to be picked up, making it clear her claim on my space was ending piece by piece. At 9:30 p.m., a knock came. Brian stood there, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Heard you were changing the locks," he said, eyes narrowing. I replied. "Back door only." Old one was sticking. He looked past me, scanning the room like he might spot a confession lying on the rug. "Just don't make things complicated," he muttered. I smiled, small and controlled. "I don't make them complicated, Brian. I make them clear." When he left, I locked the door, the new bolt sliding home with a quiet finality. In the stillness that followed, I wrote one last note in the ledger of legal protections complete. Personal access restricted. Ready for Phase 2. The street outside was empty, the lamp throwing long shadows across the pavement. From their kitchen window, I saw Lydia and Brian leaning over something spread on their table. I couldn't see what it was, but I didn't need to. Whatever they were planning, they thought the game was theirs. In 2 weeks, they'd learn it wasn't. I chose the date carefully. A Wednesday morning, when the town was quiet and the harbor breeze carried the sound of gulls instead of tourists, I called Lydia 2 days before. "We need to go over some paperwork?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. She hesitated, then agreed. Curiosity always won with her. The meeting was at Dennis Crane's office, neutral ground, but still familiar enough that it wouldn't raise alarms. I arrived early, settling into the high, back chair in the corner. The room smelled faintly of old leather and coffee. Dennis adjusted his tie, the soft rasp of fabric steadying my pulse. At exactly 10, the door opened. Lydia stepped in first, hair perfectly set, followed by Brian in his casual jacket like this was just another errand. They smiled, not at me, but at each other. That private, smug smile they thought I didn't notice. "What's this about?" Lydia asked, sliding into the chair opposite me. Brian stayed standing, hands in his pockets. "Yeah, we've got contractors coming later. So, quick would be good." Dennis folded his hands on the desk. "Your mother asked me to facilitate a review of some property matters," he said. His tone was calm, almost bland, but I caught the flicker of interest in Lydia's eyes. "Property matters," Brian repeated, leaning forward. "Does this mean we're finally moving on the house upgrades?" I let a small pause stretch between us. "I think you've both been unclear about what belongs to whom," I said. My voice didn't rise, but the edge in it made Lydia straighten in her seat. Brian gave a short laugh. "Come on, Helen. We've been over this. You've got your little bungalow, but it's all part of the bigger plan now." The bigger plan," I echoed. It tasted like metal in my mouth. Interesting phrase. Lydia glanced at Dennis. "Isn't it obvious? We've been talking about expanding, merging the properties, like we discussed before." Her tone was light, but her knuckles were pale where they gripped her bag. "That's the thing?" I said, leaning forward slightly. "We never discussed merging my property. You discussed it. Without me?" Brian shifted his weight. "You're overcomplicating things. It's family. Everything blends together eventually." Dennis tapped a folder on his desk. "That's not how the documents read." The sound was deliberate, each tap a countdown. Lydia's gaze darted to the folder, then to me. "What documents?" she asked. I kept my expression calm, almost bored. "You'll see soon enough," I said. For now, I wanted them leaning forward, not back, hungry for what they thought was theirs. Outside, a gull cried sharply, cutting through the pause in the room. Dennis opened the folder slowly, the whisper of paper the only sound. We weren't at the drop yet. Not quite, but they were exactly where I needed them, seated, listening, and convinced they were still in control. Dennis slid the first page across the desk. A color copy of the deed, with my signature at the bottom, except it wasn't mine. Lydia blinked, then glanced at Brian. What is that supposed to be?" Her voice was too quick, too sharp. "It's the version filed at the county clerk's office 2 months ago," Dennis said evenly. "According to this, your mother voluntarily agreed to merge her property with yours." Brian leaned back, arms crossed. "So, if it's filed, it's done." Dennis didn't even look at him. "It's not done. This signature is a forgery. And the notary stamp," he tapped the corner, "belongs to someone who moved out of state in 2019. The air in the room felt heavier, like the walls were leaning in. Lydia let out a brittle laugh. "You can't prove we had anything to do with that." I met her eyes. "Can I?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the photos, each one showing the folder in their kitchen drawer, dated and time-stamped. One showed Brian's handwriting on the margin of a draft, the same looping bee he'd used since high school. Brian's jaw tightened. "You went through our house?" "You left the door unlocked," I said. It was true, and I let the silence after hang like a weight. Dennis slid another document forward. "This is the updated trust agreement executed last week. The bungalow and the land it sits on are now held for Ethan until his 21st birthday. No early transfer, no liens, no sale without his written consent after that date." Lydia's face went still. What about the upgrades we planned?" Her voice cracked just slightly. "That's your business," I said. "But it won't be with my property or my money." O'Brien leaned forward, palms on the desk. "You think you can just cut us out after everything we've done?" The laugh rose in my throat before I could stop it, low, without humor. "You mean after everything I've done? Paid your bills, covered your emergencies, watched Ethan every time you wanted a weekend, and in return you forged my name and planned to take my home." Lydia's lips pressed into a thin line. "We didn't ask you to pay our bills. You chose to. The sentence landed like it had that night on my porch, cold, deliberate. But this time, I didn't flinch. This isn't about what I chose. It's about what's mine. And now it's protected. Permanently. Dennis closed the folder. That concludes the legal matter, he said. Any further attempts to interfere will be documented and prosecuted. Lydia stared at me like she was trying to find the old version of me. The one who said yes to everything. But she wasn't in the room anymore. And the version sitting here? She wasn't leaving. For a moment the room was still. Only the faint ticking of Dennis's wall clock broke the silence. I let it stretch, let them sit in it. Let the truth sink in. You think you've cornered me? I said finally. But all you've done is push me into a place where I remember who I am. Brian scoffed, leaning back like he'd heard this speech before, but his hand drummed against his leg. Too fast, too tight. I'm not your safety net, I continued. I'm not your bank, and I'm not your silent guest in a house I bought. Lydia's eyes narrowed. You'll regret cutting yourself off from family. The words might have stung once. Not now. Family isn't who takes your roof and calls it theirs. Family is who stands beside you without scheming for your chair. I slid the last envelope across the desk. Inside was a single page, a formal notice to vacate the small storage shed on my property where they'd been keeping tools and supplies for their so-called expansion project. You have 7 days, I said. After that, anything left will be donated. Lydia's mouth opened, then closed. Brian stared at the page like it might burst into flames. Dennis spoke next, his tone calm but unyielding. This is all within her rights. You will comply or will proceed through court. I stood, smoothing the front of my sweater. My hands were steady now. I'll see myself out, I said. As I reached the door, Dennis called after me. There's someone waiting outside for you. When I stepped into the hall, Ethan was there, leaning against the wall, backpack slung over one shoulder. Mom said I had to come with them, he said quietly. But I don't want to ride back with them. The lump in my throat surprised me. I managed a small smile. Then walk with me. We left together, the sound of gulls and the distant roll of the tide filling the space between us. Halfway down the block, Ethan glanced up. They're mad. I know, I said. They'll get over it. Or they won't. He kicked a pebble into the gutter. I'm glad you're keeping the house. I looked at him then. Really looked. And saw the trace of his grandfather in his grin. It felt like the first warm thing I'd held all day. When we reached the corner, I stopped and took one last look back at Dennis's office. Behind those walls, Lydia and Brian were realizing the game was over. Not just the scheme for the house. Over for the way they spoke to me. The way they thought they could twist my generosity into obligation. The wind off the water was cold, but it carried something sharp and clean. The kind of air you breathe when you've stepped out from under a shadow? I tightened my scarf and started walking. Phase 2 was done. What came next would be the part they never saw coming. The morning after the meeting, my house felt different. Not physically. Same creak in the floorboards. Same gulls circling beyond the dunes, but lighter somehow. As if the air inside had stopped bracing for an intrusion. I made coffee and drank it by the kitchen window, watching the tide crawl in. No footsteps on the path between our houses. No shadow lingering outside the porch. By noon, Lydia's usual drop-by hadn't happened. For years, she'd come over under the pretense of borrowing sugar or returning a dish, always managing to find her way into conversations about bills, renovations, or family plans. The absence was louder than her knock would have been. Ethan called after school. They're not talking much, he said, his voice low, like he was passing a secret through the phone. That's all right, I told him. Sometimes quiet is good. I spent the afternoon sorting through drawers, not in a frenzy, but in a deliberate, steady rhythm. Old receipts, unused coupons, brittle rubber bands, gone. What stayed was what mattered: letters from Martin, photographs where everyone was smiling without effort, the blue seashell Ethan gave me when he was 6. By evening, I'd cleared a whole cabinet. I didn't need to explain to anyone why it felt important. Every inch I reclaimed was a reminder that this space and the life inside it belonged to me. Outside, the wind picked up. From my porch, I could see the faint glow of lights in Lydia's kitchen. 2 shapes moved inside, their gestures sharp, restless. I turned away before they could notice me watching. Dinner was simple: grilled cheese and tomato soup. I ate it slowly, savoring the warmth against the damp chill that crept in after dark. For the first time in months, I wasn't rushing to finish before an expected interruption. When the phone rang just after 8, I almost didn't answer. It was Mrs. Callahan from 3 houses down. Just wanted to say, she began, "Folks around here talk, but not everyone believes everything they hear. If you ever need anything, Helen, you let me know." The kindness caught me off guard. It reminded me that not all eyes were watching for my mistakes, some were looking out for me. After hanging up, I stepped outside. The night smelled of salt and wet cedar. The moon was high enough to silver the water, each wave catching the light like a held breath. I thought about the last week, the layers of planning, the long, careful silences. I'd spent so much time bracing for their next move that I hadn't noticed how ready I'd been for mine. Inside, I wrote a single line in the ledger, Phase 2 complete. Boundaries restored. The words looked solid on the page, their edges sharp and certain. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. They wouldn't accept the loss quietly forever. And part of me, the part that had been silent for too long, was ready for whatever they tried next. For now, though, the night was mine. I locked the door, turned out the lights, and let the sound of the waves carry me into sleep. 2 days passed before I saw Lydia again. She was out front, carrying grocery bags from her car. We locked eyes for a split second, her look unreadable, my own steady, and then she turned away without a word. It was strange how silence could be sharper than shouting. I could almost hear the things she wasn't saying, every unspoken jab sitting heavy in the air between our houses. I didn't let it touch me. Instead, I poured my focus into the small things. I mended the hem of a sweater I'd been ignoring for months. I scrubbed the porch railing until the white paint caught the afternoon sun again. Ethan stopped by after school, claiming he was just walking by, though I knew he'd taken the long way home. We made cocoa in the kitchen. He told me about a science project, about how his teacher said he had good focus. When I asked if he wanted to stay for dinner, his grin was answer enough. We ate chicken stew and fresh bread at the table by the window. For once, there was no rush to get him back before someone came knocking. No sidelong glances at the clock, no worry about the next interruption. Later, after I walked him to the corner, I noticed Brian's truck parked in their driveway. The engine was running, but he didn't get out. Just sat there, staring at the steering wheel like it might give him answers. The next morning, a letter arrived, no return address. Inside was a single flyer for a beachfront renovation showcase, circled in red. A message without words, meant to remind me of their plans. I folded it once, dropped it in the recycling, and didn't think about it again. I was done reacting to them. This was my space now, and the more I filled it with my own rhythm, the less room there was for theirs. I called Mrs. Callahan and offered to help with the community garden. We spent an afternoon pulling weeds, swapping recipes, and talking about the way the ocean seemed to change moods overnight. By the time I got home, my hands smelled faintly of basil and earth. At night, I started keeping a lamp on in the living room. Not because I was afraid, but because I liked the way the light made the bungalow glow from the outside. Solid, lived and untouchable. One evening, I caught sight of Lydia through her kitchen window. She was on the phone pacing, her free hand cutting the air in sharp gestures. Brian walked past in the background, shaking his head. I didn't stay to watch. Whatever storm was brewing over there, it was theirs to weather. In my own quiet, I was beginning to feel something I hadn't in years, not just safe, but grounded. Every choice, every boundary I set now was mine alone. Before bed, I stood at the porch rail, breathing in the briny wind. The moon was high, silvering the water in a way that made it look endless. That's what this felt like, an expanse I could finally walk into without asking permission. I knew the final chapter of this would be mine to write, and I was ready. 3 weeks later, the mornings had a new kind of stillness. Not the tense silence of waiting for trouble, but a gentle quiet that wrapped itself around the bungalow like a shawl. I woke early, brewed coffee, and stepped out to the porch. The air smelled of sea salt and damp pine from last night's rain. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries carrying over the rhythmic hush of the tide. Inside, my desk was no longer a pile of old bills and urgent notes from Lydia. Instead, it held a single ledger, a vase of wildflowers, and the application forms for the community support fund I'd decided to start. It wouldn't be much at first, just a modest grant to help older women cover small but vital needs, a leaky roof, a bus pass, a new pair of glasses. But it was something that mattered, something that would outlast the noise of the past months. Ethan had helped me name it. The Shorelight Fund. He said it should be like the light on the water that helps you see where you're going even in fog. For a boy his age, he understood more than he should have had to. We met every Saturday now. Sometimes he'd help me sort applications, sometimes we'd just walk along the beach, our voices low enough to get lost in the wind. One afternoon, he handed me a shell, striped, smooth, and warm from his pocket. "Another for your collection," he said. It joined the blue one he'd given me years ago, both sitting on the kitchen shelf where I could see them while cooking. Around town, people had started nodding to me in that quiet way small towns have, subtle, but sure. The whispers about Lydia and Brian's plans had cooled. I heard they were keeping to themselves, busy with some renovation work inside their own place. The edge between our houses had grown into a polite distance, and that was enough for me. In the afternoons, I worked in the garden. The rosemary had thickened, the lavender humming with bees. Kneeling in the dirt, feeling the sun warm my back, I realized I wasn't measuring days by what might go wrong anymore. Each one was simply mine to live. One evening, as the sun slid low and painted the water in shades of copper, I stood on the porch with a notebook in hand. Part of me knew there was one more thing to do. One final act to close the circle. It would be less about making a point to them, and more about marking this place, and this season, as truly mine. I closed the notebook, the plan forming as surely as the tide that would be here tomorrow. The morning I chose was clear and bright, the kind of day when the horizon looked close enough to touch. I woke before dawn, packed a small basket, and slipped on my jacket. Ethan met me at the porch, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Ready?" I asked. He nodded, too curious to complain about the early hour. We walked the path through the dunes, the sand cool under our shoes. The sea was calm, the waves folding over themselves in a gentle hush. I led him to a spot near the old driftwood log where Martin and I used to sit. From the basket, I pulled out a wooden box. It wasn't large, just big enough to hold a few items I'd chosen carefully: the original deed to the bungalow, the first ledger page from the Shorelight Fund, and the 2 seashells Ethan had given me. His eyes widened. "You're not getting rid of them, are you?" "Not at all," I said. "I'm placing them where they belong, together in the heart of this place." We dug a shallow spot just above the tide line, the sand cool and damp. I set the box inside, pressing the lid down gently before covering it again. The earth felt different under my hands. Not like I was burying something, but like I was rooting it deeper. When we were done, we sat on the driftwood, watching the tide inch closer. Ethan leaned against my arm. "So now it's part of the beach? It's part of the story?" I said. "And no matter what happens, it will always be here. Just like this house, just like us." For a while, we just listened to the water. The sun broke the horizon, throwing a path of gold straight toward our feet. I breathed in the salt air, letting it fill every space that had once been crowded with fear and anger. Back at the bungalow, I brewed tea and poured us each a cup. We sat at the kitchen table with the window open, the sound of the waves carrying in. Ethan asked if he could help with the next round of applications for the fund. I smiled. "You already are." Later, after he left, I stood at the porch rail and looked out at the sea. Somewhere beneath the sand, the box rested, my quiet signature on this chapter of my life. The wind lifted, cool and clean, and I felt the weight of the past month shift entirely off my shoulders. I wasn't just keeping the house. I was keeping myself. Every choice, every boundary, every bit of peace I'd earned. And as the tide rolled in, I knew this was the image I wanted to end on: the bungalow, the sea, and the certainty that my legacy was already in motion.